Good morning, world history. Today we are going to talk about the struggle for North America. So the last 2 days we've been talking mostly about South and Central America in line with Spain and Portugal. But today we're going to talk about North America. So this is going to be a little bit more familiar because we're going to be mentioning a lot of United States history. So in the 1600s, France, the Netherlands, England, and Sweden all join Spain in settling North America. So now it's not just Spain and a little bit of Portugal. Now it's France, the Netherlands, England, Sweden are all wanting their piece of the pie. So in New France, by the early 1500s, French fishing ships are crossing the Atlantic to harvest cod off of Newfoundland, Canada. Within 100 years, the French occupied nearly half of North America, mostly up in Canada. French claims in Canada, which they called New France, so they called Canada New France, quietly grew while French rulers were distracted by wars at home with Europe. In 1534, Jacques Cartier began exploring the coastline of eastern Canada, eventually discovering the St. Lawrence River. Traveling inland on the river, he claimed much of the present-day eastern Canada for France. Jesuits and other missionaries soon followed, and they advanced into the wilderness, trying with very little success to convert the Native Americans they met to Christianity. The French, though, focused on industry, not necessarily on colony building. They focused specifically on furs, trapping, and fishing. So they traveled inland with the help of some Native American allies that they made, and basically the Native Americans that they would make friends with usually only made friends with them because they were hoping for help against rival Native American tribes. Eventually, the American Empire, ruled by France, reached all the way from Quebec to the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River, so France even had parts of Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico. The population of New France, however, grew very slowly. The French were there for over 100 years before they developed the first permanent settlement in Quebec in 1608, when Samuel de Champlain established a colony in Quebec. So you have these wealthy landlords that are buying huge tracts or areas of land, and a lot of farmers want to settle it for farming, but the harsh Canadian climate with its long winters is not really attractive. Here you want to move from France, which has all 4 seasons, to Canada, which mostly has winter, and you can't grow anything. Not that attractive. Okay, so your first permanent settlement is Quebec in 1608. And their biggest industry was fur, trapping, and trading. So in the late 1600s, the French King Louis XIV set out to strengthen royal power and boost revenues, which was his income, specifically his income from taxes. Okay, so revenue. So, Louis also sent soldiers and more settlers, including women, to North America. Now, a permanent settlement isn't going to last very long without both men and women. I'm sure you can figure out why. And so Louis was Catholic, though, but he wanted to send men and women to increase the settlements, but he didn't want to send any Protestant men or women. And so he actually prohibited Protestants from moving to New France. And so the population of New France actually remained very small compared to the population of, say, the 13 English colonies, which we're going to talk about next. So the 13 colonies, of which Florida was not one because Florida was still owned by Spain. In 1497, a Venetian navigator known by the English name John Cabot found rich fishing grounds off of Newfoundland, which he claimed for England. Later, English navigators continued to search for a northwest passage to Asia with no success, because if you've ever looked at a map of Canada, Canada's very big and there's an awful lot of islands. It's very difficult to sail through northern Canada to make it to Asia on the other side. And so the English decide to build colonies farther south. And so they established their first permanent colony in 1607 at Jamestown. Jamestown was in Virginia. Although the colony was meant to bring wealth and profit, the early years did not. And most settlers died of starvation and disease. The rest survived with the help of friendly Native Americans, and that's where actually the Thanksgiving, well, not the Thanksgiving tradition comes from the Plymouth settlements up in Massachusetts. But the settlers at Jamestown faced something very similar, where most of them were dying until friendly Native Americans took pity on them. The colony finally made headway when the settlers started to grow and export tobacco. That was really the first time that the settlement became successful. The Native Americans had been cultivating tobacco for thousands of years, but it was new to the Europeans. In 1620, another group of English settlers landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts. These are the famous Pilgrims of the Thanksgiving. So that was actually later. So you have the Pilgrims in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The Pilgrims were English Protestants who rejected the Church of England. They sought religious freedom rather than commercial profit. So the Jamestown settlers moved to America to be profitable. The Pilgrims moved because they wanted religious freedom. Before coming ashore, they signed the Mayflower Compact, which basically set out guidelines for governing their North American colonies because they didn't want people to get greedy or selfish once they got off the boat. A compact is an agreement among people. Today we see this document as an early step towards self-government. It was the first document in the United States where people were in charge of themselves. Many Pilgrims died in the early years, but local Native Americans taught them how to grow corn and helped them survive. That's where we get Thanksgiving. And soon a new wave of English Protestants are beginning to arrive in this colony now called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The English colonies definitely kept growing. In the 1600s and 1700s, the English established 13. Some, like Virginia and New York, were commercial ventures that were specifically organized for profit. We want to go here and we want to form this colony because we want to get rich. Others, like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, were set up as havens for persecuted religious groups. So Pennsylvania was set up as a haven for Quakers. Maryland was set up as a haven for Catholics, and Massachusetts was set up as a haven for Pilgrims and Puritans, both of whom were technically Protestant but were still persecuted by the church. Still others, like Georgia and South Carolina, were gifts from the English king to loyal supporters. Settlers in all of the colonies spent the early years struggling to survive. Most of them abandoned hope pretty quickly of getting rich quick, as the United States, particularly the English colonies, did not hold vast reaches of gold and silver mines, unlike the Spanish had found in the more southern areas of the Americas. Over time, though, they learned to create wealth by using the resources native to their surroundings. So in New England, prosperous fishing, timber, shipbuilding industries really grew. In the middle colonies, farmers grew grain, and in the South, they were mostly focused on cash crops such as rice and tobacco. They therefore developed this plantation economy, much like we talked about yesterday in some of the Spanish, where the plantations being the big farms. As in New Spain, colonists imported African slaves to clear land and work the plantations, with most of the slaves being needed where the plantations were, which was in the southern colonies. In several colonies, especially in the South, enslaved Africans and their descendants would actually eventually outnumber the people of European descent. So they're importing so many people from Africa, they're kidnapping them, that they actually eventually grow to outnumber those that came from Europe. Governing the colonies. So English monarchs were very much like, we are in control. They did this a couple different ways. Some of them would appoint royal governors to oversee colonial affairs and had Parliament pass laws to regulate trade. But compared with the settlers in Spanish and French colonies, English colonies really enjoyed a lot more self-government. Okay, they were left alone a lot more than France and Spain were. Each colony had its own representative assembly, so they basically made their own mini governments, and elected, not born into it, that advised the governor and made decisions on local issues. So there's a lot more local representation. The tradition of consulting representative assemblies grew out of English experience. In the 1200s, like we learned after the Magna Carta, Parliament began to play an important role in English affairs, and elected officials are the ones who are advising the king. Slowly, English citizens are gaining certain legal and political rights, and so when they go to America, they want to keep those same political rights. When colonists later protested British policies, they viewed themselves as free-born Englishmen defending their rights. So later, when you have the beginnings of the American Revolution, they're saying, well, in England we had these rights, why don't we have them over in America? So they're not saying we want different rights than we had before, they're saying we want the same rights as we had before. Okay? There's a map on page 485 I recommend you spend some time looking at. I'll take a picture and send it for anybody that needs it. But yeah, that map really helps understand European land claims in the Americas in 1700. Now, to finish up, let's talk about struggles for power, mostly English versus France in North America. So by the 1600s, Spain, France, and England, and the Netherlands all had colonies in North America. Sweden's colonies had already gotten kind of eaten up by the Netherlands and England. They began to fight, both in the colonies and elsewhere around the world, because the colonies, the Americas are not the only places that these countries are trying to colonize, right? Last chapter we learned about nations going to Asia, going to Africa, and so when these countries fight, they're not just fighting in America. The Spanish are moving north, making claims to Texas, making claims to Florida. The English and the Dutch are maintaining their colonies along the east coast. Native Americans throughout the colonies are entering the conflicts because they want the Europeans gone, so they're trying to play the Europeans against each other. And then competition is fierce in the Caribbean because you've got these sugar-producing colonies that everybody wants. By the 1700s, the French and English Caribbean islands, worked by enslaved Africans, had surpassed the entire North American exports. So basically, the Caribbean islands were the most profitable, like the single most profitable area of the Americas. And so this rivalry actually turns to war. In 1754, you have this French and Indian War. Which is also known as the 7 Years' War. Now, it did actually last 7 years, for the record. Sort of. Okay, so the 7 years thing is a little tricky because it more lasted like 9 years, but it depends on who you ask, because in 1756, it spread to Europe. So in 1754, it starts in the U.S. In 1756, the war spreads to Europe, and that's why a lot of the Europeans call it the 7 Years' War, because from 1756 to 1763, when it ends, is 7 years. But in the colonies, it was actually being fought for 9 years, so 7 years is, it's a little funky. In 1756, it also spreads to India and to Africa, so this truly is a world war. We don't call it a world war, but it is. It's being fought in India. It's being fought in other parts of Asia. It's fought slightly in Africa. It's fought in the Americas, and it's fought in Europe. That's pretty global. And this rages until 1763. During the war, British soldiers and colonial troops launched a series of campaigns against the French in Canada and also in Ohio, which belonged to the French at the time. At first, France is winning, but in 1759, British troops launch an attack on Quebec, which is the capital of New France. The British scaled steep cliffs along the river and captured the city. Although the war dragged on, the capturing of the French capital in Canada was a pretty big blow to France. In 1763, it ends with the Treaty of Paris. One of the treaties of Paris. There's several. Named because it was signed in Paris, and it ends the worldwide war and actually ensures British dominance in North America. So it's one thing to say the British won, because you don't know if they actually 100% won in like India or Africa or Europe, but they definitely won in North America. France ceded all of Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain. But retained the rich sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean. So France still had the sugar-producing Caribbean islands, but now England had most of Canada and all of the 13 colonies through the Mississippi River. France also was able to keep much of Central North America. So land looked a little bit different after the French and Indian War. So the map on page 485 more tells you what the land was like before the French and Indian War, and then after the French and Indian War, North America gets reshaped, redivided a little bit between England and France. So that's today's lesson. If you're starting to recognize some of this from American history class, that's pretty familiar because this is where a lot of American history classes start. So you've got this struggle. So you have three main powers fighting for control in North America: England, France, and Spain. Okay, so tomorrow we are going to talk about the slave trade. So it's definitely a harder topic to talk about because it's so brutal. But it's really important to understand the awful conditions and the really horrible things that were being done to Western Africans during this time. Okay, so good luck with your JunoPod. Again, let me know if you guys have any questions, and I will see you soon. Okay, bye.